of 1992. It's weak. It's prostrate. Its economy is ineffective. Remember the McCain statement? Oh, Russia is Spain with a gas station. All of these arrogant displays of American hubris, treating Russia as though it was a third-class nation with a fourth-class military. Well, we're getting an education right now. We paid no attention to the Russians who had legitimate concerns about what we were doing in eastern Ukraine. We were building an army to attack them. We put a hostile government into that country in 2014. And we kept telling them that it made no difference to us what they thought or what they cared about. They said, we don't want NATO on our border. No one paid attention. President Trump tried to listen, but he was surrounded by people who subverted him, people who were not loyal to the president, who took an oath of obedience to the orders of the president and then ignored them. So what's the outcome? You've got a very serious war that could become regional, even global. And no one in the White House seems to really grasp that. But we're losing. The globalists are losing. And when the ground dries, and in June, you're going to see a massive Russian offensive, and most of what we call this thing called Ukraine is going to be swept away, especially that government in Kiev. But that government doesn't represent the interests of the Ukrainian people. They represent the interests of this globalist elite who are interested in resources and stripping them and using them and exploiting them to make money.
Yeah, and there are also people that don't seem to have any of America's interests at heart, even if America's the guy funding all of this to the tune of 130. And, you know, that'll double and triple, and the Pentagon lost 220, you know, they misplaced $220 billion in their budget. If you lost $6 in your, IRS statement, they'd be auditing you, but they can lose 220. So I imagine most of that went to Ukraine, but it feels like, the biggest threat to America is actually what's happened to the petrodollar, when you have Putin now talking with the Saudis and Putin now talking with Xi, and you get rid of the petrodollar, and all of a sudden all that borrowing that we do, where we're living way above our means, that's no longer possible, plausible, or worse. And it seems like we've opened the door for that. So, I guess that works for the globalists because they're probably the guys coming up with this idea, and they don't care about taking and getting rid of American hegemony.
No, I think
that's a real problem
matters
for America. But again, this is still the Americans pushing this, even though it's literally happening before our eyes, and everyone's pretending like this is a non-issue. Because I guess it's a non-issue if you're in France or the UK or any of the other places, because you get to knock America down a peg. But what that does to the American people is disastrous.
No, I think what you're seeing is this war has become financial as well as military. And the globalists understand that they're going to lose this war. And what will come of this is that the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are going to be increased by 81 additional members. And all of these people are going to go to a currency that is backed by gold. And once they go to that currency backed by gold, whether it is one currency or a basket of currencies, it doesn't make any difference. Yes, we are in a lot of trouble. The globalists know that, and it is why they are so desperate right now. And the greatest fear that I have is that when the Russians do attack and it becomes abundantly clear that Ukraine is finished, I mean, it's already obvious to anybody who visits the place for any length of time, it's in ruins. But once that occurs, I fear that there will be pressure to commit U.S. forces in Poland and Romania, along with Polish forces and potentially Romanian ones, to Western Ukraine. And if that occurs, the gloves will come off, because truthfully, thus far, Putin has exercised tremendous restraint, tremendous patience. He does not want a war with the West. If he wanted that, we'd already have it. But if we intervene in Western Ukraine, it's over. We'll be in a full-fledged war.
Expand on that a little bit, because it's sort of interesting. You say, like, hey, this started, maybe Putin was going to do it anyway, but the reality, this started, in my opinion, because, NATO was talking about taking let's call it a 500-mile-long buffer zone that has been historically a buffer zone since basically World War II, which was the Ukraine, and moving NATO's borders towards Russia. Now, maybe Putin was going to do it anyway. I'm not saying he's, a good guy or a nice guy. I'm not apologizing for him, but no one seems to talk about that the movement of and the talk about moving NATO onto Russia's border when you had this very large buffer zone of the Ukraine. was sort of the excuse that they needed. I mean, it is as though we were goading him into this to begin with. And, you know, what are your thoughts on all of that?
I think we grossly miscalculated. Putin had made several speeches over the last 20 years, repeatedly saying, please do not advance the border to Russia. Do not try to transform Ukraine into a hostile actor, an actor with hostile intentions towards Russia. What happens in Ukraine is of existential strategic interest to us, just as theoretically what happens in Mexico is of existential strategic interest to us, although this administration has decided to ignore it. That's going to come back to haunt us, and if you're looking for future conflict, that's where to look for it, not in Europe and not in Asia. But the point is that Putin wasn't pulling any wool over anyone's eyes, and Putin absolutely didn't want a war. If you go back and look at the force that he sends into Ukraine earlier in February of 2022, he goes in with about 90,000 troops. He limits his advances to the periphery because he expected that we would negotiate, that he would demonstrate that this was serious and that Russia wanted its population in eastern Ukraine, which is really Russian, to have equal rights before the law. He wanted to end the oppression of the Russians that lived there. And he wasn't going to surrender Crimea. The reason he went into Crimea is he was afraid it was going to be turned into a U.S. naval base by the Ukrainians at the earliest opportunity. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. Now, he went along and thought that he might get a negotiated settlement, and he finally figured out after several months, nobody's going to talk to me, especially after Biden said, our goal is regime change. Our goal is to get rid of Putin. And our goal is ultimately to divide Russia into constituent parts, then exploit it. All of his supporters, his staffers, everyone in the globalist camp knows this is the truth. The so-called oligarchs, Kolomoisky, Soros, and others are all part of this. None of this is news. Finally, he said, enough's enough. He stopped. They set up a strategic defense. They ran an economy of force mission, and now they have a force in place that can go as far as it needs to go, which includes to the Polish border. They have a plan for a 31-month war against us if we insist on fighting it. And we are in no shape to fight a war. We can't even recruit for the United States Army or the Marines. The Marines are running around trying to recruit illegals and are being encouraged to do so by the administration. Is that what you want in the ground force to fight for this country? Forget it. It's not going to work.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess that's interesting. I mean, a lot of people probably aren't aware of that because I think when you look at it sort of on paper, you know, you obviously have the media reports, right? Every time, you know, Russia takes a big town, well, it's not really of strategic importance, but every time Ukraine claws back 7 inches in a major military victory. So, you know, you see the gamesmanship happening in the media, but I'll say this as an outsider who doesn't know and perhaps, you know, didn't know that, hey, maybe that was maybe him coming in was to bring everyone to the table in a negotiating tactic. But, you know, you think of it like me with sort of, again, that Cold War mentality of like, you know, the Russian army will steamroll. It's like, well, how did they not take over this country in 2 weeks, let alone, you know, a year and a half now? To me, and maybe to the uneducated on the subject, it feels like maybe one of the bigger sort of miscalculations or underperformances of recent military history. Is that not the case, or is that also a combination of it? Did he, you know, misjudge some of it, or is that just because, you know, 130 billion in missiles given to a militia, you know, can still hold back someone who's not going all out, or, you know, using tactical nukes or whatever it may be, that next escalation where he could, you know, again, take over the country rather quickly?
Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is an Orthodox Christian country that is rooted in Russian nationality, history, culture, language, and ethnicity. So forget the Soviet Union. Ukraine is a brother Slavic country. The last thing Putin wanted to do was destroy Ukraine. Putin would have been perfectly happy to have Crimea recognized, to gain those equal rights for Russians inside eastern Ukraine, and to declare the place neutral. Because the neutral Ukraine would have provided exactly what you're discussing, not only a buffer for NATO and the West, a buffer for him, for Russia. He wasn't interested in any of the things that he's been accused of. That's what Professor Mearsheimer has said anyone who understands Russia, knows what's happened over there since 1992, gets it. All of that's over now. Your dad, President Trump, could have intervened in February or March and put an end to this quickly. And I'm confident that he would have. We would have convened talks without preconditions. We'd have come to some sort of new territorial arrangement. And I think we would have had a neutral Ukraine, which was in everyone's interest, and no war. But now those days are past. This government in Moscow, it's not just President Putin, his entire population is enraged. They don't trust anyone in the West, especially since Chancellor Merkel and now President Macron have both admitted that the so-called Minsk Accords, which were supposed to address these issues, were a facade. They were a fraud. They were designed to, quote unquote, buy time to build up Ukraine. And they built it up. That was not a militia that was defending eastern Ukraine. They were actually very good soldiers. Most are now dead. They've had 300 to 350,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, another 300,000 or 400,000 wounded. They're now forcibly dragging old men and boys into uniform to fight. They're desperate, which is why they'll take anything they can get. The Russians are not desperate. They don't have a recruiting problem. They've had 100,000 volunteers in addition to the 300,000 reservists or more that they've mobilized. Russia's population is squarely behind Putin. What have we got here in this country? We have a divided society, divided along every conceivable issue, from economics, class, race, you name it. And this society doesn't even support the military establishment that desperately needs talent and Americans inside uniform. And this is what this administration thinks it can commit to a war? I mean, this is sheer lunacy. We need to get out of this before we're dragged into something. And the notion that we could take on the Chinese, a nation of 1.4 billion people, what do you plan to do with your military power against that? What makes you think anything we would do would influence them? And as President Trump pointed out, that's an economic competition, one that he could handle. Unfortunately, we're not even in the competition anymore. We've surrendered.
Well, the Navy has a drag queen influencer that's going to help the recruitment problem right now, Colonel, so I'm sure things will be just fine. What could go wrong?
Right. That's true. Well,
maybe Xi will laugh himself to death because I have a feeling that's probably not going to have the intended effect. Or maybe it will have the intended effect, and that's just where the military is right now. But maybe talk about your military background. How did it shape your views on foreign policy? Because I know as we talk about the wars, I think your views on war and perhaps America's involvement in war have also changed, right? But from some of the early sort of Middle Eastern stuff, where you were at the beginning of that to where you are now has probably grossly changed. So how did that evolve?
Well, remember, I and most of the people of my generation, our formative experience was service in NATO in Europe. And when NATO went away, most of us stood around in 1992, 93, 94 and said, well, NATO has to go in one of two directions. Either it becomes Europeanized, in other words, the Europeans take responsibility for themselves, we can still be a partner, or we just leave because there's no mission for us in Europe anymore. By the way, I had plenty of experience with Russian organizations and units after the fall of the wall, and I can tell you they were absolutely not our enemies. In fact, they did great work for us, particularly before we went into Afghanistan. But if I go back to the 1970s and I look at the ruins in which the military was found at that point, and then look through the 1980s where we rebuilt and we improved our position dramatically, it took very little time after 1991 for that military to be dismantled and ultimately to be ruined. And we got more and more generals and more headquarters and fewer soldiers. We lost 163,000 experienced combat soldiers in 1991 and 1992. And we kept every general officer we had on active duty and added some. This is the problem. This rot has been underway for a long time. And we've lost the discipline, the cohesion, the esprit de corps. I would say Special Operations Forces was an area where there was a holdout. And of course, the administration hates special operations because they claim it's another hotbed of white supremacy. So they're now talking about trying to do away with as much of it as they can.
Everything is white supremacy or climate change, just so we're clear. I mean, at least in the minds of the left, any problem can either stem from white supremacy or climate change or both. So, yes.
So my argument is in 1991, we were a very healthy organization, but we were also disappointed, many of us, because we thought that we had gone over there to fight a war and win it. We discovered after a very short period of time, hostilities were ended. And then the big lie was perpetrated that, well, we really didn't set out